Thank you, Neil. Now we're going to move swiftly on to the panel discussion, and I'm going to call up our various speakers. We have a distinguished panel. They are Arno Berger, who's the Director of Sustainable Development at BPCE. Come on up, Arno. Neil, we already have. Daniel Esty, who is the Environment and Energy Commissioner from Connecticut, the US. We have Cheryl Fisher, who is the Director of the Energy Department at the European Investment Bank. Andrea Hagman, who is a member of the Executive Board of the Development Bank of Austria. Gernot Mittendorfer, Chief Risk Officer at the Erste Group. We have Ian already. And Christoph, can you come back up, Christoph Nuttall, our 20 Executive Director. And last but not least, Josue Tanaka, Corporate and Managing Director for Energy Efficiency at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Now, we have another set of questions that the organisers have asked us to cover. So if you can turn to your interactive devices, hopefully the questions will come up in a second. They're about innovative finance mechanisms and how they might impact on climate flows. So this first question is a test to how many of you were listening when I made my opening remarks. In 2011, how high were global investments in clean energy? That's despite the debt crisis in Europe. So if you can press your devices with what you think is the correct answer there. I think quite a lot of you were listening. So it was 260 billion in 2011, so around a quarter of what IEA thinks is needed. We're going to do a second question now. In comparison, how high do you think investments were in 2004? Okay, so again, we have a very switched on audience there. So really only a fraction of what we're seeing currently. Very significant leaps there, but the question is, are they significant enough, and how much are we going to see them grow? Well, maybe innovative financial instruments offer the answer. Now, I'm going to start this panel session by asking each of our participants to try to spend no more than 3 minutes sharing their thoughts on the opportunities offered by innovative financial instruments and this shift towards them in terms of trying to address this scale issue. So I'm going to go and start at the end there with Andrea. Would you like to kick off for us, please?
Thank you very much. Is it on? Thank you very much. Thank you also to the organizers to invite me here to this panel. I'm very honored to be here, and I would like to start actually with briefly introducing the Development Bank of Austria that I'm representing here. Development Bank of Austria has been founded 5 years ago by the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are working on a mandate of them, and we are basically providing long-term financing for private projects in developing countries. Our target is to promote development in developing countries and to reduce also poverty. We have heard that developing countries are heavily impacted or will be impacted also and stay impacted by the climate change. That's why we also chose from the very beginning that energy and that projects that are mitigating and adapting climate change will be our focus areas. At the end of 2012, we had a portfolio of 500 million euros, and 30% of these 500 million euros accounted for these kind of projects adapting to climate change. I know that in relation to the numbers that you have just seen, this seems to be very small, but I think the real innovation and the real thing that we have to do in the future, and to do more of it in the future because it already happens, is to get together and to cooperate. There is, as we have heard, public money limited, and public money is not enough. And we have heard enormous figures, and I can give you another figure that is estimated by the World Bank for the developing countries. There will be a need between until 2050 about $100 billion of investments for climate change mitigation. I do think that the money is available and the money is here, but the question is how you can get access and how you can tap the funds. And as other speakers have already said, it will be the private investors that we are looking for and that we are trying to get into the programs. So how to do this? And I think there are some challenges we face, but I also see solutions coming up. One challenge is, we have heard it today in the morning, is something that can be provided by the regions and the governments. It's to have incentives that they provide for these energy projects. It's also to raise the awareness of the need to do more in this respect. A second part is private investors do have money, but they are very risk sensitive. So they need risk takers and they need instruments so that their perception of the risk is a little bit lower and that they feel comfortable and can come in these projects. So public-private partnership funds was one of the big solutions that happened the last couple of years, and especially development banks have worked a lot on that kind of structure where public funds or public money is coming in. They are the patient capital and they attract private money. But there are also guarantee instruments, for example, that can be used here. So, as I said, I think working together is the real innovation, understanding the needs of each other and trying to combine the projects that might be already here and available.
Thank you, Andrea. And I think this theme of dialogue and effective risk sharing is one we're going to keep coming back to. Arnaud, would you like to share your thoughts? I know you're going to be speaking in French, so translation sets on.
Sorry. Thanks. Oui, désolé, je vais parler en français. Je voudrais faire deux rappels, s'il m'est possible. Tout d'abord, l'Europe, c'est 90% de PME. Or, la stratégie européenne appuie beaucoup, et on le voit aussi dans les débats, sa stratégie sur des outils de financement de marché. Et on parle beaucoup de fonds d'investissement, mais il faut savoir, nous avions fait une étude dans les années 2007 pour la Commission européenne, que seuls 10% des PME en Europe avaient le profil de rentabilité pour accéder à ces outils de financement de marché. Or, je pense que les PME sont un défi important pour la croissance verte et c'est une volonté de l'Europe de les soutenir. La croissance verte, quand on en parle dans le domaine du financement, il faut, d'un point de vue d'un banquier, il faut quand même s'intéresser à une chose, c'est la rentabilité. On peut parler de beaucoup de produits, mais on parle très peu de la rentabilité. Si la croissance verte, les énergies renouvelables, l'efficacité énergétique étaient à 20% de rentabilité sur fonds propres, je pense que tout le monde irait. Tout le problème, c'est comment travailler avec des rentabilités qui sont assez faibles, aujourd'hui de l'ordre de 4 à 7% de rentabilité. Donc c'est pour ça qu'on s'aperçoit dans ce domaine que les PME sont les structures économiques les mieux adaptées à ces faibles profils de rentabilité. À l'inverse, c'est juste une question que je pose dans le débat, c'est que quand la rentabilité va venir par la rareté, on va dire, de l'énergie ou des matières premières, et que tous ces marchés vont décoller, la seule limite au financement de ces marchés, dès qu'ils sont rentables, c'est la limite du financement. Qui aura l'argent pourra avoir les marchés. Et quand on l'a vu, on s'est aperçu que dans les premiers marchés des énergies renouvelables, en Europe, que ce soit l'éolien ou le photovoltaïque, cela ne s'est pas transformé en succès pour l'Europe. Donc c'est pour ça que ce qui est très intéressant, c'est aussi de s'intéresser, c'est de travailler sur les financements pour les PME de faible rentabilité. Et là, on tombe sur les financements locaux. Comment travailler sur des prêts, des garanties et valoriser les taux des financements. C'est pour ça qu'on a mis 6 ans à travailler avec la Commission européenne, qu'on remercie, et puis la banque publique allemande, la KfW, à mettre en place un programme qui s'appelle Helena KfW, de financement local de l'efficacité énergétique, que ce soit pour les particuliers, les PME et les copropriétés en France. Donc ce sont des prêts qui ne sont pas d'un grand montant, mais dont la masse va devenir très importante, tous ciblés sur l'efficacité énergétique, donc la réduction de carbone. Voilà, et en espérant, donc on est la première banque européenne, mais en espérant que ça fasse des petits, puisque l'objectif, c'est vraiment de soutenir à la fois l'économie, mais aussi l'emploi, tout en réduisant le carbone. Mais comme le disait Heidi Carbone, dans des opérations programmatiques. Et c'est peut-être là où les PME sont les plus fortes. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Okay, some important points there around the fact that innovative instruments can be used to support businesses, new business models, as well as projects themselves. And of course, SMEs, very important in innovation and driving technology change. So now we move on to Daniel and an American perspective on this question.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am a commissioner of a Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, DEEP, but I like to joke that there is a third E, the economy. So like President Barroso, I believe that energy, the environment, and the economy can move together, and that if done right, you can promote prosperity and jobs. And for those who think there's nothing being done in the United States on climate change or clean energy, it's not true. There is, however, not much action at the federal level, but lots going on at the state and local levels. And I want to share with you just a couple of minutes today about the Connecticut model, led by Governor Dannel Malloy, and I think delivering a very new approach to clean energy and to the need to respond to climate change that I think will grow as the model becomes more clear, both across the United States and around the world. It centers on 4 elements, 4 I's, as I like to say: innovation, incentives, investment, and implementation. Innovation, because we do need to do things in new and different ways. If we do more of the same, we're going to get the same, not very satisfying results. So we need creativity and innovation, not just in terms of technology development, but in our policy frameworks, in our incentives, and most importantly, in finance. So that is what we're trying to do in Connecticut, but we recognize that there is a limit to what government can do. Indeed, budget crises are the order of the day in governments all across the world. So our focus is not on trying to have the government do the spending, but rather to shape the marketplace. And that requires careful policy attention to the structure of incentives that either engage or fail to engage private capital and the private marketplace. So we're very focused on trying to use our limited government money to nudge private capital into action, to overcome uncertainty that keeps people out of the marketplace, and frankly, to harness market forces so that we get the kind of results we're looking for, in particular, lower cost clean energy. Because the key to progress, and I think we see it in the backlash against high subsidies across the world, is to drive down the cost of both efficiency and renewable power to something much closer to the baseline cost of what is, in most places, fossil fuel-based energy. So we're doing that with creative incentive structures, not the typical feed-in tariffs or subsidies, but frankly with an approach that looks much more at harnessing market forces. We've developed a zero-emissions renewable energy credit that is an inducement for those that want to do renewable projects in the state of Connecticut to cut costs, because we use a reverse auction structure to determine who gets picked to carry out projects. And in doing that, have driven down the cost of renewables, and we're technology neutral. We don't do a special subsidy for wind or for solar. It's an across-the-board reverse auction structure that's cut in half the price of renewable power. And finally, we do think that there is a need for investment. We do recognize that there is a role for government in that regard. We've set up a green bank. We've also launched creative structures like a property-assessed clean energy fund that helps lower the cost for our businesses of borrowing money for renewables or for energy efficiency projects, backed by the state and paid back on the property tax bill, which provides a certainty of repayment that makes the cost of capital very low. All of this is aimed at that final I, implementation. We think the key here is not more talk, not more plans, but action. On the ground delivery of projects. So we're very focused on deployment, on execution, on engaging the business community, big and small, in delivering results, getting projects going, and ensuring that we can deliver on that 30 of economic growth and jobs on our pathway to clean energy and improved environment. Thank you.
And thank you, Daniel. And Daniel's starting there to talk actually more in investment framework, so risk-sharing instruments, but also appropriate incentives and institutional structures such as the Green Investment Bank that can really help with that. Speaking of green investment banks, we now have the European Investment Bank, which is heading off in this direction, and Cheryl, who is going to share some insights on some of their work in this area.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you. I think what I wanted to do is probably structure my few minutes around three questions, because the idea of this panel is to talk about innovative financial instruments. And so the first question that comes to mind is, do we need them? And if we do, where do we need them? And are they sufficient? Is it a sufficient condition? If we have these innovative financial instruments, what else do we need to actually make these investments happen? Thinking about do you actually need these innovations in financing? You could argue that there has been a significant increase in investments in low-carbon technologies. We've seen the graphs that Ingrid has just put up from a very, very low base 5 to 10 years ago to a very high level of investments now. And the lending of EIB has very much mirrored that. We've increased our investments in energy efficiency tenfold since 2007. Similarly, our increase in renewable energy lending has increased dramatically over the period. But actually, notwithstanding what has been really a very impressive move by the world, actually, to change the way it produces energy and the way it looks at its use of energy to a low-carbon future, we are a long way off our targets. And we look at the European Union context, and we have our 20% energy efficiency target that President Barroso talked about this morning, and we're currently on target to meet that with only 9%. So we're not going to be 20%. If we carry on as we are, we're at 9%. So I think there is a question that there's a lot of financing out there, I think, as already been said, but it's actually not able necessarily to find the right projects. So I think there is some need out there to try and develop new products. And there's a question about, so where do we need them? I think that it was very well said this morning a couple of times, once by ex-Governor Schwarzenegger, around if the price is right, the investments will come. We've seen a massive switch from coal to gas in the States. Very understandable, because the price of gas now is incredibly low, and the most sensible thing to do is to switch from coal into gas generation. So if you have the right incentives, you will see a lot of investments, and that's what we've seen to some extent in the renewable energy space, where subsidies have helped to drive investments, feed-in tariffs, premiums to fossil prices have helped to really drive those investments. Nevertheless, for very large projects, we see some barriers to investment. So very large projects with very long tenors, some of the very large offshore wind projects have failed sometimes to get off the ground because the quantum of financing is so large that it's difficult for people to actually find sufficient capital to fund them. And also the long-term nature of that funding is now no longer so attractive to commercial funders who, because of forthcoming Basel III regulations, no longer want to hold debt for more than 15 years. So what we have been doing together with the Commission is working on how one can put in place risk-sharing instruments which can actually enable perhaps more risk capital to go into the bottom of these financing structures to enhance the credit worthiness of the investments so we can actually access institutional investors. So actually tapping the institutional investor market, especially for these very long-term large investments, I think is certainly one of the innovations that we think is very valuable at the large end. The other end of the scale, though, is energy efficiency and the small renewable energy projects where we are seeing a difficulty of not enough projects, really. We don't get enough small projects to fund, and actually there are a number of barriers to funding small projects. They're all very well known. I think one of the most important ones is the psychological barrier, the inertia barrier. And I think that something that's come out for me very strongly today is the importance of regions and the regional government in that political battle, winning hearts and minds, moving it from a stick to you must invest in this to making people want to invest in these investments because you're actually changing the whole psychology around the investments. And I think that political message is very important. And when we have seen regions get strongly behind investment programs, we have actually seen projects develop. EIB has been involved in a number of projects, for example, in France, alongside BPCE, in the financing of regional programs to invest in small energy efficiency renewable energy projects. When you have regions who are committed to increasing their investments in this space, they provide a framework and they provide an environment in which actually people will think much more about investing in this sector, and that of itself is an important drive for people to develop these small projects. The difficulty, though, is nevertheless that these projects are very small. It's not usually economic for commercial banks it can often not be economic for commercial banks to invest in the teams that they need to actually evaluate these projects and to invest in them. The risk-reward is not a good balance. And therefore, I think one of the things that we're looking to try and do is to see whether there are risk-sharing instruments we can put in place with commercial funders, provide technical assistance to promoters to develop these small projects, and to be more incentivized to actually bring smaller projects which actually provide a lot of the benefits that we need to see in order to meet our energy efficiency targets forward. I just want to say one other word for, I think, another very good experience that we've had, which is with the Covenant of Mayors initiative, where we have, again with the Commission, put in place a programme called Eleanor, which is, again, technical assistance to regions to help them do very much, I think, what was being discussed earlier, to develop frameworks, develop projects to a stage which they're then bankable and can actually be taken out of the market, funded either by EIB often, or by commercial funders or by other funders. But it's actually in that project creation that we see the great need at the moment, especially for the smaller scale renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. And initiatives like Eleanor, or the initiatives perhaps that's been discussed today by Idea Carbon and R20, I think is a very positive contribution to developing those projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. So, as well as the big projects, we need to be focusing on those smaller energy efficiency pieces, which are so critical, I think, in the short term to driving jobs and growth. But political will, more boldness to drive the project pipeline is important. Over to you, Christophe. No? Okay. Okay. Right, we're going to go now straight to Josue, who I know has limited time. So, Josue.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. So, I will describe you very quickly two things. One is, since it's all about action, so to try to describe to you a bit the example of a development bank, in this case the BRD, in this area of energy efficiency and renewable energy, and two, to ask the question that was asked by our moderator on innovation. So on the aspect of action, we launched a very specific initiative, particularly oriented to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, because that is in a way our mandate, about 6 years ago. It was a pilot at the time Today, it represents between 25 and 30% of the total investment that the EBRD does in the region, roughly about 2.5 billion euro per year in this area. So over this period, we've invested in about 600 projects. Of our own resources, we've invested 11 billion euros. Total project value of this investment, 60 billion. And I think because we're talking about the climate, total impact expected at implementation about 50 million tons of CO2 reduction per year. That is about the emissions of Sweden. Okay, so that is just to give you an example of what an organization can do, if you focus particularly on this project. I think it's interesting because we are in this R20 context to also say, in practice, with numbers, what has been achieved among these numbers with municipalities and local governments. So very quickly, about 2 billion of the 11 billion has been operations at sub-sovereign level with municipalities or regions in our countries. And this has represented about 10 billion of total project value out of the 60. So now that I've hypnotized you with all these numbers, let me turn on how it's been done. I would say two things. First thing is a combination between three ingredients, and these ingredients were mentioned by previous speakers, so I will just mention them. One is investment, because I guess that's why we're in this panel. Two is policy, and number three is technical assistance. Each of these is necessary in different mixes in different countries for different types of projects. So then let me move quickly to innovation. I think the innovation question, particularly for those of us who work in markets that are not advanced markets, has to be looked at in two different ways. First, what I would call classic innovation, and then perhaps innovative innovation. What do I mean by classic innovation? Is that there is a huge scope to deploy very classical financing instruments that are not used in this area in a number of countries in which we operate. So what do I mean by this? Sub-sovereign financing is something that when we started in the former Eastern countries or former communist countries just didn't exist because the municipal level didn't exist. So in a way we had to build that from the bottom together with the countries. The second element I would say here is this aspect of working with the private sector. Right? I think there is huge leverage that can be achieved, and we can show you projects in which we spent, and this goes to the question on how to spend best the scarce public money. We have many examples of projects where we may have spent something like 30,000 euros in an energy audit, which has brought €250 million investment from the private sector without any form of subsidies. Okay, so you can achieve huge leverages by essentially being able to intervene just at the blocking point and no more. I think the third element, I would say classic, is how to involve the commercial banks that operate in our countries to become the agents and work, in smaller projects. And I think this, to a certain extent for us, has been the way we have solved the question that was raised by the colleague from EIB on how do you reach smaller enterprise and how do you finance small-scale renewable energy projects and how do you finance small SMEs in this energy efficiency. Today, just to give it again, we have a network of 64 local banks that are essentially in the countries implementing these projects. Actually, some of them with Ørsted, with our colleague will speak about later on. So this is what I call classic innovation. We're not inventing anything new, but we're bringing instruments that are proven into contexts where they've not been used before. Second is innovative innovation, because there are cases in which you need to devise new things. I'll just give one because I want to be short. It is a structure that we've developed to fund energy-saving companies, ESCOs, right? It's a magic word in the energy efficiency world, but when you look at Eastern Europe, there is almost nothing that happens in that space. So we came up with a structure, financial, quite complex, called essentially a ESCO forfeiting fund, and I can explain that later, but not now. But essentially, it is a structure that tries to deal with the low capital efficiency of ESCOs. So in closing, I would just mention perhaps 4 key elements that we think are very important to think about, particularly around the R20 challenge. One is creditworthiness, right? And I think particularly when you deal with the local level and try to work with the local level directly, you need to understand what are the sources of local creditworthiness. The second point is cost recovery. That's always unpleasant, particularly in local levels, because it needs to go to a municipal council, and the mayor needs to convince, the municipal council of why tariffs ought to be adjusted in order to be able to do the investment. Not always easy. The third one is profitability. It was mentioned previously, and there I may a bit diverge from, at least in terms of experience. Our experience in energy efficiency financing is the opposite. The IRR of our energy efficiency projects is on average twice the IRR of the projects of our regular portfolio. Okay, so we don't have a profitability issue with energy efficiency projects. And finally, institutional capacity. And I link that to innovation, because sometimes the more ambitious we are on innovation, the higher the institutional capacity that is required, and that may be a problem at times. Thank you.
Thank you, Josue. Because I know you have to go, just a quick question back to you. You said you're developing all these new tools and instruments. How applicable are they in different geographies? So obviously you're testing one project out in Slovenia. Can that then be applied to Poland? What are the sort of issues or constraints there?
There are a lot of points that are generic. So in other words, when I mentioned the question, for example, of municipal creditworthiness, the elements and the questions that you need to address are essentially generic. But how you deal with them in every country is very different. Because the politics, for example, I just mentioned one aspect, the politics of fiscal decentralization change a lot from one country to the other. So in some country, you may have really ironclad stability in the tax base at the local level. In other countries, it may be changing every year, right? And so if I turn to Mr. Mitteldorfer, he will obviously feel that there is quite a difference in terms of the risk, that one is taking in an environment in which, you have this kind of flip-flop versus. I think also certain instruments, like what we've been able to do with banks, if we've been able to develop this network with 64 banks, is because the approach essentially works, but you need to adapt it then to the strategy of each of those local banks. And each of them has particular business challenges. So again, I don't want to generalize too much, but I'm just trying to say that the instruments and the reason we've been able to increase our financing in energy efficiency and renewable obviously depends on some standardization of the projects and the approaches, but at the end of the day, it is using these standard approaches and adapting them to each context which makes the difference.
Okay, thank you, Josue. So a certain amount of applicability, but again, it comes back to this issue of having good dialogue in terms of how you implement them. So I'm going to move now to Gernot. This is the guy who says yes or no to projects brought to him by his bankers. So Gernot, what opportunities do these instruments offer for you?
Well, we as in Erste Group, we are basically a bank that is operating in the region between Germany and Russia in the eastern part of the European Union. And we were basically mainly taking over banks in privatizations and investing and expanding towards the east. And we are very active together with international financial institutions in the renewable energy part, being as a financing partner, most recently before he leaves with EBRD in a big wind farm project in Romania. But also since the very beginning, more than 10 years ago, we've started our first project in energy efficiency, our first product in the Czech Republic, basically reaching private individuals and small and medium-sized enterprises. And our role is basically, on the one hand, a financing role, but on the other hand, also a mediator and distributor between the international financial institutions and our customers in the region. We are having 17 million retail customers and 1 million micros and small customers covering throughout the region. And I think through our role, we can achieve a significant multiplier effect. What we've done, for example, in the Czech Republic, I was working 9 years in the Czech Republic. There was a huge initiative towards renewable energy. What we've done is we've created our specialized department, we've trained our colleagues, we've set up the policies, and we were collecting individual loan applications, processing them, financing it, and then we were teaming up with international financial institutions and agreeing on risk sharing contracts, basically, where we were covering the first piece of loss, the first 5%, and the IFIs were basically sharing the risk. This created additional volume that we could provide to financing of the renewable energy projects, and then at the end of the day, after reaching almost $500 million in financing, we were combining all our customers, bundling them, and introducing them to a big regional distribution company, and they were upgrading their pricing and gave them additional pricing, so they had a better feed-in tariff. The combination with IFIs, we could reduce the financing costs for our customers, and at the end of the day, through these initiatives, providing higher funds and better terms for the customers to get a bigger volumes deployed. In addition, we are not only helping our customers, we take it a responsibility on our own as well. We are in Austria since last year 100% renewable energy company, and we are very happy about that, and we are very proud about that.
Thank you, Gernot. So the messages I take from that is the innovative instruments being deployed by the IFIs is really helping you to move into this space. And an immediate question that falls out of that for me is, do you have a sense of the point at which you might be able to work in these kinds of projects without the support of those other financing institutions, the public financing institutions?
I think one extremely important aspect is the political aspect that was covered by my colleague already, and this is what we've seen in our region, decentralizing and then later on centralizing. In long-term investment projects, the most important thing, what you need is stability. And we've seen in one country, we've seen there were over-subsidizing the renewable energies, so they were later on introducing a tax on the profits or the turnover, basically. And in some other countries, they didn't properly plan the subsidies and the funding, and they were changing the financial flows and moving back from a decentralized basis to a centralized basis, which caused losses at the investor levels. So a very important and I would say a prerequisite for getting bigger funds deployed, getting bigger projects financed is a significant effort on getting a credible environment, political environment that gives credibility and trust to investors.
Thank you. And over now to Ian for your insights on the opportunities around these instruments.
I think there are huge opportunities. I think we have to look at where are the nuggets. There's one thing to talk about IFIs, but that is money that is there. That's not incremental money. We're looking at a very big deal if we're going to start changing our planet. and investing in next generation energy. The gap, the financing gap today is probably of the order of 500 million a year or so. So we have a big deal out there, and I think it's going to be to the institutional investors, the sort of pension funds and the like. And there I think we have to, in some sense, build capacity within them. They have to understand that there is a trajectory where you can get a reasonable long-term return for relatively safe investment, provided that the investment climate in the country or in the municipality is relatively predictable. So I think that is where we have to put a lot of emphasis, working with the R20 to get predictability and stability into the political and regulatory environment on the one hand, but also make sure that the institutional investors understand the opportunity that does exist, and it is very great. I think we've got to be cautious about putting too much of the eggs in the IFI basket. That money is there. It's not going to grow exponentially. We're going to have to look to private institutional investors as really where the incremental finance will come from.
Thank you, Ian. So again, this issue of stability in the incentives framework is coming up. And finally, over to you, Neil.
Okay. I suppose if a project is bankable, it's bankable. It is therefore financeable. So I think the innovation, and especially for this group, has to come around things where bankability is a problem. And so we would be looking for instruments that can credit wrap to take out, if you have non-bankable counterparties handling waste streams, if you have a non-bankable technology, because it's a small family business making the kit, can you go and find ways of converting that, either through portfolio effect or through insurance products? Insurers will sometimes credit wrap situations. And then the other thing is looking at innovative ways of getting equity. So can the host city supply the real estate as part of the equity package? Can someone supply a long-term waste contract that could be monetized as part of the equity? You just need for these projects to build equity and debt. And so it's innovation around those things that will enable the unbankable projects to get financed. That's the challenge. The bankable ones and the very large ones with the really professional large, the Siemens and the big guys, they can get financed. It's how you do stuff on the ground in areas where there's political risk, uncertainty, instability. How do you credit wrap and sort those things? So that would be where I think this group needs to innovate to allow its members to supply projects and make a real difference.
Great. So again, this need for dialogue, I think if there's one message that comes out today, it's that there are solutions, but we need to work together, the financial community, the project developers, and the governance of regions, national governments, to ensure that those risks are properly understood and addressed. Now, we're unfortunately a little bit running out of time. We've been talking about these technical instruments. We've had a lot of good examples. One very sort of practical question that falls out for me is, where should the expertise be held for developing these instruments? Should it be held within the financial community, public or private? Or do we need to see greater levels of financial expertise actually at the regional level, in the governments, regional governments, in the municipalities? An obvious person for me maybe to direct this to is Daniel.
So I think one really doesn't want to choose between having it solely in the private sector or in the public sector. You need both. And I think we've seen that in setting up a green bank, it's actually quite critical to have true banking skill and financial expertise. And I think in the past, governments have not been as focused on delivering results. Today, everyone is benchmarked, everyone has metrics, and if you aren't really delivering for the people on whose behalf you're investing money, the people of, in my case, the state of Connecticut, you won't get more money. So I think it is critical that we have a seriousness of purpose and an analytic rigor brought to bear. And I think the outcome, again, has to be not just clean energy, but cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable. And that really is what's critical over time.
Okay. I'd also like to direct it to the couple of public bankers we have here. So, Cheryl, members of your team are wrestling with these issues every day, I think.
It's an interesting Interesting question. Where should the expertise be held? And I'm a bit sort of torn in a way, because certainly some of the best projects I've seen can come because there's a very good individual working at a regional and local level who really knows what they're doing and actually brings everybody together to bring forward really good projects. But that so much relies on there being a small number, an individual who's very, very good in a region. And I think that we don't get enough projects that way, because actually the expertise we're talking about can be very specialised. So my view is that actually having green investment banks or investment banks which really can help to supplement and really work very, very closely with the individuals in the actual projects themselves to provide the expertise, I think is the sustainable solution, rather than relying actually on individuals who happen to be very talented and happen to have the expertise actually just sitting in a regional office. So we need to make better use of the expertise by bringing them, I think, probably into a regional context. Yeah.
Okay. And Andrea, you work a lot in developing countries, so outside the European Union, so very different issues.
I think we are talking here about technical knowledge, and we are talking also about the knowledge how to develop a project. I'm convinced that part of the expertise has to be in the banks that are also dealing with the financing of the projects. But I have the feeling that it's actually getting an industry also. And there are own companies who are specializing on project development. And I think we also see them with the funds, and we also try to support them with our technical assistance money that we have. And I think it's especially helpful to have these experts who are not only experts in how to develop a project, but they are also experts in the region, and they have a good network in the region. So I think you need this expertise in different institutions. But I think the interesting thing is that there is a new industry that is at the moment also developing, and we will need maybe more of that.
Okay. And I'm going to just do one last round, because I'm aware we're nearly hitting 5 o'clock here. One of the things we have heard a lot about today is the need to get scale capital in, which is really, for me, the institutional investor community, the capital markets, bonds. My perception, and this might be wrong, is that a lot of innovative instruments are focused on risk sharing it around new technologies, new business models, perhaps less so on addressing these issues of scale, securitizing loans into the bonds market and so on. I'd be interested to hear the panel's views on that and where the balance lies. Do we need to be doing more of one or the other? Do we need to be doing both at the same time? Andrea, have you got views on that? And feel free to pass if it doesn't feel right.
I think we have heard a lot of things now from the panel, and there is a lot of agreement here that there is a lot of money out there, and we need all of it. So we need all players, and I think it's not either or, but it's that we need all of it. I think the securitized bonds have been a little bit old-fashioned due to the reasons that we all know. But I think maybe we need new models for these bonds. But I'm convinced that we also need these bonds as instruments to come in, and that we have a good mixture of different sources that will also help, and that will also match the needs of the projects. As we have heard, every project has different needs. It needs different things in the project preparation. It needs patient capital like equity long term. It needs maybe risk mitigation like guarantees or insurances. But it also needs a huge amount of money. And if we only concentrate on only some of these sources, there will not be enough money. We have heard enormous amounts that will be needed.
Okay. I think Cheryl's desperate to jump in on this one, so why don't we jump straight to Cheryl? Oh, sorry.
courses, though, isn't it? Horse of courses, in the sense that when we're talking about small-scale investments, which are with SME-type customers, you know, the commercial banks have a natural client base. They know these people. They work in the market, and actually, it's best to let them do what they do well, and then potentially to package them up and securitize them at a later stage. I actually pass them onto the bond market once the projects are proven. But I think initially it's about getting them to work with their SME customers, to work with the projects, and that might need a bit of risk-sharing work going on with them. So I think for those sorts of smaller investments, actually risk-sharing initially and then potentially securitization later is important. If the institutional investors can come in perhaps more at an earlier stage for larger investments, or if we could aggregate projects during the construction phase for smaller projects. That is a great challenge still, but it clearly would be great to get there. And actually the initiatives that we've heard today from IDEA, Carbon and R20 might be the first step on that road. But I think you have to do both, actually. So.
Okay. Daniel.
So I would just add to what Cheryl said. I think you've identified two of the critical problems that creative financial institutions need to address. One is that there's a lot of small projects, but the transaction costs of carrying them out are too high. So I think if you can create mechanisms to bundle those, you're going to get a lot more traction in the marketplace. And I continue to believe that despite the fact there's a pretty good track record of clean energy investments in many countries, that it's still seen as new and still seen as risky. And there's an insufficient track record for many financial kind of backers. And therefore, again, the value of some risk sharing to help reduce that sense of nervousness on the part of those that might bring capital to bear is another critical purpose of what we've devoted our Green Bank to doing, and I think is going to be needed in regional governments all around the world and supporting financial institutions that are trying to make clean energy a priority.
Okay. Arnaud, did you want to pick up this point?
Alors, pour reprendre les termes de la personne de la Berde, dans l'innovation classique aujourd'hui, sur les financements d'efficacité énergétique ou d'énergie renouvelable dans le diffus, chez les PME ou les particuliers, il y a surtout de l'innovation dans la distribution des financements. Il faut vraiment qu'on industrialise dans les banques locales et les banques coopératives, sont elles généralement qui sont sur le devant de la scène dans ce domaine, à distribuer les prêts écologiques. C'est des montants, la moyenne des montants par exemple en France, c'est 16 000 € par prêt écologique pour les rénovations thermiques des bâtiments. Ça, il faut qu'on l'industrialise. C'est-à-dire une très bonne filière entre l'industriel, le distributeur, l'installateur, le professionnel et le client. Et l'expertise, assurer que l'expertise technique est commune à toute la filière. Cela veut dire un rôle entre la banque et la collectivité pour avoir la transmission de l'expertise dans le prêt. La banque peut faire un bout du chemin, mais la collectivité doit aussi faire un bout du chemin. Nous avons calculé, on a beaucoup parlé de fonds et d'investissement, il faut savoir que l'investissement dans les projets, c'est 20% de la solution. 80% de la solution, après, c'est le financement, la dette. Quand on voit l'augmentation des investissements, il faut y multiplier par 80% pour avoir ceux de la dette. Et donc, effectivement, on va manquer d'argent si on n'y prend pas garde. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'au niveau local, puisque aujourd'hui les marchés sont essentiellement locaux sur le diffus, il faut absolument travailler sur assurer ce financement local, soit par des livrets d'épargne écologique, des comptes à terme, ou le refinancement. Heureusement, on a aujourd'hui la BEI ou la KfW pour nous, la Berne pour les pays de l'Europe de l'Est, ou les banques de développement. Donc, mais ça sert à assurer ce refinancement aujourd'hui, mais il va falloir que les régions prennent elles-mêmes en compte avec les banques la capacité avec l'Europe de générer l'argent localement pour pouvoir le prêter. On a beaucoup parlé de risques. Et là, nous, évidemment, nous militons pour développer les fonds de garantie sur les prêts. Les fonds de garantie permettent, bien mieux que les subventions, d'améliorer le profil de financement. Et enfin, c'est l'idée de IDEA Carbone, mais d'autres pays aussi, c'est améliorer la rentabilité des prêts en trouvant une valeur financière supplémentaire, celle du carbone évité, ça peut être celle du kilowatt évité, ça peut être celle de la biodiversité préservée. Quelque part, c'est le rôle des financements liés, ou des marchés liés au carbone ou au vivant qui permettent justement de faciliter les investissements écologiques. Donc c'est un peu un triptyque. Trouver la ressource, donc les livrets, développer les garanties pour faciliter les prêts et développer la valorisation financière. Nous avons eu un exposé. Mais tout ça, l'industrialiser, mieux intégrer la banque dans l'ensemble de l'économie et surtout, à un taux raisonnable. Voilà. Aujourd'hui, nous allons pouvoir sortir des prêts à 2% fixes sur 10 ans, pratiquement pour les particuliers. C'est à cette condition qu'on arrive à développer. Aujourd'hui, on a plus de 2 milliards de financement dans l'environnement, pour notre réseau seulement, et ça se fait uniquement dans les régions. Voilà.
Christophe, do you want to pick this one up?
Yeah, I would like to thank all those panelists because obviously you have given us, I would say, a lot of food for us to work on in order to, I would say, fine-tune what R20 can do with those different institutions that we have here around the table in order to access those funds for our members and with our partners. And I believe that some of our partners, in addition to IDEA Carbon and others that I'm not going to name, but they are here in this room, that I think we have now a number of paths through which we know where we have to go in order to make sure that one day we will have this scaling up effect, not for us, I repeat, but for our members, for our cities and regions all around the world who are so keen to develop those different projects. So thank you so much.
Now, we're at 5:10 now. We've had a very good discussion. I think we're going to leave it there now with apologies to this side of the panel. I have one last question that the organisers want us to ask. So if we can pick up our interactive panels and put the last question up, which is, what would your personal motivation be to invest in the green economy? Returns, green conscience, regional value added, predictable investment risk, or long-term investment? And it's long-term investment. We have financially savvy people in the audience. Okay, so I guess in terms of summing up, the clear message that comes through is we can resolve these problems, but it's going to require better dialogue between the financial project development and executives in the regions. Greater institutional capacity may or may not be needed in the regions to be able to deliver project pipelines and effectively deploy public finance. One thing I clearly got was that innovative financial instruments are not the panacea, they're not the silver bullet. They have to be looked at within this wider risk-reward framework, and feed-in tariffs will continue to be important. And a real need to address the instruments that strip out risk or share risk in the early stages of new business models developing, new technologies being deployed, but at the same time we do need to be looking at this issue of scale. So can we bring back bond or loan securitization in particular? So analogies with the comments around the mortgage markets there. So I'd like you to put your hands together for our fantastic panel. And with that, we shall end. I've just got an announcement for the R20 partners. Could you meet at the front of the stage to talk with the Austrian Energy and Climate Fund? Thank you.